about government-centered politics, civics versus other sorts of institutions. Can you take that further and talk about how other more private institutions or totally, family ones or faith-based in the full, scheme of all the different kinds of life, collective life beyond the individual, play into what you were talking about?
I'll try. I mean, I think in some ways you've already said it, which is to give us a bit of a list of all the institutions that matter for changing the world. But if you get together a group of kids and you ask them to pick an issue that concerns them, let's take childhood obesity, which has been a big issue for the kids that I tend to work with, and they start thinking about how do we make the world change so that childhood obesity is less of a problem. One issue is going to be the government and subsidies for agriculture and so on. It's not going to be the only issue. They're certainly going to be thinking about families, which have an enormous effect on the way kids grow up and what they eat, and on the possibility that they could directly influence families. They're going to be thinking about community-based organizations. They're going to be thinking about business. And as our students go forth into the business world, they can be contributing a lot if they're thinking about the broad public interest. They might be thinking about market strategies. Could they create for example, there's often, as we all know, I don't have to tell you, there's often a tremendous lack of healthy food for sale in poor urban neighborhoods. Well, is there a market solution to that? Is there a new form of business that could provide that? And those are the kinds of questions that our students will ask. Faith communities are relevant. There's often a tremendous lack of safe exercise opportunities in the same communities where obesity is a plague. So could the church put a basketball court out in the back? So they will tend, if we start with them and the problem rather than with government policy, they'll think about government policy, but it won't be the only answer to their question. Was I getting it roughly what you're... Yes?
So I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about values, because I think ultimately the kind of programs that we design and the kind of the way in which we deal with what we might term civic engagement in the classroom ultimately revolves around values. What's important to us in order to engage, because well, I think you'll agree with this. I mean, civic engagement alone can, as we said before, can be positive or negative. And I remember some debates around Bob Hutton's book, which is to say, getting people in bowling leagues and all that, they're out of isolation, but that may lead to, join the Klan or join the whatever.
Yep.
But the three terms that I wanted to ask you to address in terms of values. One is the term social justice. There are civic engagement programs. There's like 300 or so social justice programs in colleges and universities. It's sometimes a contested term. The issue of diversity a little bit more, because in some ways in creating the public square, we look for common ground, and sometimes that means glossing over the differences and doing a one-size-fits-all when it doesn't. And then the third thing is just the role of the humanities. You're probably familiar with Imagining America and the work that they do. Martha Nussbaum's new book about the humanities and the need to really value the humanities as a first step toward addressing values in terms of our intellectual and our civic work. So.
Yes. No, those are great questions. I mean, and they're not just questions, because you've actually said a lot in there. So I'll just bounce off it a little. Where you stand yourself on questions like social justice is a complex question, because I think we all need to have our own really strong moral commitments, and we're also educators and creators of spaces where there can be dialogue. So there's a question about how much we want to be relatively neutral on those questions, and it's a tough issue. I'm not totally sold on neutrality as a high virtue, partly because I'm not actually sure it's all that good educationally, because I'm not sure that when kids are exposed to somebody who's pretending to be neutral, the effects are what you think, which is that you think the effects would be then that they'll be open-minded and stuff. I think to some extent they're just sort of confused, and they're actually better off being presented with a fairly serious, defended, open-minded commitment to a set of values and outcomes that they can then bounce off of. There's a great book by James Eunice and Miranda Yates about a Catholic school in Washington, D.C. The kids in the school are mostly African-American Protestants. They're being taught by mostly white Catholic priests. And the priests give them this huge dose of values, very specific, not just social justice, but more specific. They're partisan, they're very much Democrats, and they're also Catholic. And the kids don't get brainwashed by any of that, but they feel that the priests were potent examples of what it is to live a life of commitment, and they end up in a different place from the priests. But I think it's a tough question, because clearly what we don't want to do either is just tell our students this is social justice. The term itself is complicated because it has different meanings that you already alluded to that. One of the meanings it has actually is from the Catholic social justice tradition. So in some contexts, if you start using the phrase social justice, people think you've been reading a lot of Jesuit writing, and so you have to decide what your right message is.
There's secular versions.
Yeah, no, I know. The other reading of it is that it's definitely left of center, which is, again, it's sort of fine with me, because that's probably how I would vote. But I do think, one of the conversations we were having yesterday or this morning was about also needing to be careful about not suppressing the voices of conservative young people in contexts where they're a minority, which is the context that I've been in my whole life. And they have, it's also patronizing to them to think that we're the only ones who think about justice or social justice. Diversity is a very important cluster of issues. And I would actually, because of the way you introduced it, I would actually throw in civility, because I'm not a huge fan of civility per se. I think there's anger out there, and there's there are things that provoke true anger, and if civility is our guiding light, then that means, and that is translated to politeness, and so everybody has to act in a certain polite way to everybody else all the time. We lose a lot of energy. So I'd like to see diverse people mixing it up in ways that are sometimes pretty unpleasant. But we have to be careful about how we include all kinds of people, and that partly means diverse cultural forms. The seminar is one kind of engagement, but there are other kinds of engagement. In the humanities, I believe really, really deeply. In fact, my stuff in the humanities isn't well known at all or valuable, but I've actually written a book about the humanities in this area. The two things that are really distinctive about the humanities that come to my mind right off are the explicit awareness of values and dealing with those and not treating them as just a matter of opinion. And the other thing is the engagement with narrative. So much of civic life is actually stories. It's the stories of our individual lives and the way they interact. So I think the humanities are essential to this. I'm sure there's much we could keep on. I'm sure you could add. If I gave you back the mic, so to speak, I'm sure you could say much more about it.
I have a question about how we miss the mark here at the university on civic engagement, and I'm thinking of two examples in particular where we have the opportunity to engage students in meaningful, major issues, and we not only miss it, but we run from it. And one is having to do with funding, when we had major cuts here last year. And there was some outcry by a very small handful of students who were able to pull it together on their own and speak out about that. And then there were a few faculty who came together. But for the most part, we as a university distanced ourselves from the students and from what they were doing and turned it into a fringe affair, rather than using the opportunity to figure out, so what do we do with thousands of students and all this money that we have here to try to do something about the issue. And the other one was, we have a pretty sordid history here at the university of taking over land all around us, as is true for many other universities as well. And this continues to happen. We're continuing to take more, and yet we are not working with our students to try to figure out how do we stop that from happening, or how do we start getting the conversation to be much larger than who's got the power within the Illinois legislature to make this happen, given all these other things. And it seems to me that that's the kind of civic engagement that could motivate and engage students in a way that going to work in a nonprofit organization is not going to do it, or maybe do it in a very different way. Okay, do it in a different way. So and that gets back to the values issues of questioning authority, which I think you said at one point that we don't manipulate students, maybe I misread you. I think we really do. I think I think our civic engagement activities largely are manipulative to get students to engage in a particular kind of way.
Good.
So-
Well, I think that's a great critique. You should always be asking that question. And I felt, in part, I felt it would be a little rude for me to blow in here, having never been to UIC until yesterday afternoon, and tell you that you do manipulate. But I think it's worth. You're not supposed to, and it's worth thinking about. And the question of the university as a powerful institution, but by no means an all-powerful one, because it's very much affected by Springfield and so on, and by the city, is a great topic. I mean, it should be wide open. So because the outcome we want is not that they all march on Springfield to demand that the university gets its funding. They might start questioning why the price of the university has gone up so fast and what's going where. Why is the university spending so much money? I'm not, saying that's the right answer, but a really sophisticated, information-based critique of the university as an economic agent would be amazing. Also, schools. I mean, my strongest exposure to urban public schools was the DC public schools, because I lived there for 15 years and my wife taught in them and my kid went to them. And famously, the DC public schools spend $13,000 per kid, of which $5,000 actually is spent at the school level. And I always thought the most dangerous, but the most perfect community-based research project for high school kids would be to find out what happens to the other $8,000. Yes.
Now, when you were talking about the role of the university as sort of the aggregator of information and the distiller, that brought to mind, for me, the idea almost of the land-grant university's role.
Yeah.
So do you see sort of a 21st century an information grant model as a way to look at that, sort of an extension service for information?
That's a great idea. And actually, there is a paper out there that's 8 or 10 years old called the 21st century, the land grant. It's some combination of the phrases you just uttered. The other, so that's that would be a beautiful thing. Land grants, literal land grants have extension offices in every county in the United States, or at least they used to. I don't know if that's been cut back. So that's an amazing infrastructure. There's also a heritage in the land grant tradition that we tend to lose, which is, as I understand it, and I've just been told this by colleagues, it started off with agriculture extension agents very much in a two-way dialogue with agricultural communities. And they were not only going out to tell them stuff, they were also really learning from them. And they were very embedded, and they tended to come from those rural communities. They literally were residents of the rural communities who got hired by the university. And that changed as agriculture got more and more sophisticated and scientific-based, so that then there came to be a dominant land grant thing, which was basically, we know how to produce better seeds for you, and so we're going to come give you the seeds, which produced some tremendous gains in productivity, but cut universities off from their communities. So if I were with you and others developing a 21st century land grant system, it would be information-oriented rather than agriculture, and it would be two-way again. Yes?
You talked about the conflicting goals and needs of the university, originality and generality versus community relevance, immediacy. Do you see that gap narrowing or widening as you look around?
Oh boy, well, that's a really good and hard question. I think there's some pressure on professors now to be more relevant and immediate, and you see this even with the federal NIH grants where you're required to explain the relevance of the work, which drives a lot of scientists crazy. They don't know what to do with that. So I think there's that pressure, but the pressure is probably also being applied because some of the really deep underlying trends are in the bad direction, which is the research getting more and more, complex, sophisticated, specialized, smaller, and the incremental gains are so far from what anybody can understand. So especially in the hard sciences. So I guess, that's as good an answer. I think it's a great question, which I really don't know the answer to, but I feel like probably the answer is that there's a basically bad underlying trend, but it has started to stir up some significant opposition. Yes?
I think that's where I ask this. I work in a small office on campus that has a limited amount of funding, and we're charged with a lot of outreach and connection on what are most likely very civic and policy-oriented issues, both the university and the greater Chicago and global community.
Yep.
Office of Sustainability, big question, right?
Yep.
So what tips can you give or recommendations as an institution and as many offices that have similar missions on different subjects to engage the campus community what mechanisms should exist to get students to show up? Because one of the challenges we have, especially this month, it's Earth Month, we're